Greetings, salutations, I'm Dexter from Research Stripped, and in a previous episode, Bellatrix covered what she believed were the predominant stereotypes of strippers. Does research support her proclamations or prove her false? Bellatrix's video is linked down below if you want to rewatch it or see it for the first time. In this episode, I won't be discussing substance use or thievery, as these are entirely different sets of research papers. There are negative connotations attached to the word stereotype, usually because it is used to apply a generalization of a group to an individual, although it can also be useful as a descriptor of a group that does conform to a general pattern of behavior, actions, beliefs, and so on. In academia, stereotypes about sex workers are called the damaged goods hypothesis. Very original, I know. Which means that sex workers have a higher rates of childhood sexual abuse, psychological problems, and drug use as compared to typical women. Researchers in the 70s and 80s claimed that exotic dancers tend to be the firstborn and entered puberty earlier than their peers, along with being the damaged goods. More recent research has either disproven these beliefs or finding that it isn't as simple as all that. Rather, it's complicated. Exotic dancers are a diverse group, as anyone who ever sat down to talk with them should have realized, and so we need to first divide dancers into groups, then move on from there. Sloan and Webb in 2004 came up with 4 categories of strippers. The first category are the nonconformists or rebels, who usually come from middle to upper socioeconomic classes, and any childhood trauma that they had seems not to be central in their lives, and had no relationship to why they started dancing. Nearly all these types of dancers were introduced to dancing by a friend who was a dancer, and knowing the stigma of dancing, and being rebellious by nature, began to dance. The next group are the workers, normally worked in real world for several years prior to dancing. They seem to have made the move based upon financial calculations, since it was the highest paying job for their limited skill set. They usually come from low to middle class family backgrounds and rarely have histories of sexual or physical abuse. They treat exotic dancing as just any other job and are rather businesslike about it. The smallest group of strippers are those that have years of traditional dance lessons while growing up, some becoming near professionals in their style of dance. They tend to come from upper lower to upper middle classes. Just like the workers, they have rarely experienced physical or sexual abuse as children. They usually leave the industry earlier than the other groups once the work is no longer fun for them. The final group the author describes as survivors. These dancers have extensive histories of childhood abuse and come from low to lower middle class households. Not only do they normally start dancing young, sometimes underage, a majority run away from home for good before they are 18. They are the only group that seem to think that they were forced into dancing due to lack of options. But they tend not to think of themselves as victims, more as using men's weaknesses for money. These dancers also stay in the industry the longest, on average, leaving only when someone else starts financially supporting them or due to substance abuse. As this research is only qualitative or is meant only to be descriptive and not for giving exact numbers or percentages, we don't know what percentage of each type of dancer there is in the industry. From their small sample size though, less than a quarter were the rebels, slightly above the quarter were the workers, 30% of them were survivors, and the dancers being the remaining 20%. Very evenly distributed, but again, these can't be relied upon. Moving on to the next stereotype, that is strippers are or can easily be talked into becoming prostitutes. The research on this is mixed, ranging from commonly to occasionally to rarely. These instances are inferred from interviews and anecdotal evidence only, so that no numbers can be placed on what percentage of strippers partake in prostitution. From the research, it appears that it is becoming less and less common. Articles from the 1970s cited it as being common to occasionally, while the 80s and 90s it was occasionally to rare. Unfortunately, articles after the year 2000 seem to only reference early articles for the most part. There are several other issues that the research fails to distinguish. Let's start with the delineation of sex acts. For example, a topless dancer can bring a customer to orgasm just by grinding on their clothed lap. That is different than skin-to-skin contact bringing the same drippy result, and the acts can become more engaging from there, hand jobs, BJs, and so on. Moving on to the change in technology, specifically the common use of security cameras now in the clubs, pushing the illicit activities off-site, or even more recently, dancers moving to streaming for that extra income instead of the risk of involved in exchanging bodily fluids. Finally, there's a question of dancers meeting customers off-site for dates. the sugar babies and escorts that are also dancers. What exactly are strippers as prostitutes? And now for the boy toys and their tendency to wind up in custody. I was unable to find any research about significant others of dancers and their incarceration rates. During interviews, some dancers do complain about their boyfriend getting a DUI in the dancer's car or other such incidents. What is common throughout the research is that a large proportion of dancers have boyfriends that were supported by the dancer while they complain about the strippers being strippers. Up to half of the dancers in relationships reported having lovers that were either unemployed or intermittently employed. Regarding interpersonal violence in relationships, again, it is through interviews about the stigma of exotic dancers that this is brought up and is rather unhelpful. For example, one author states that it's not having a career in exotic dancing that causes violence against exotic dancers. Rather, it is the enforcement of traditional femininity, patriarchal capitalism, and normative monogamy through sex work stigma that is the source of embodiment violence against exotic dancers in heterosexual relationships. In other words, it is not the involvement in sex work, but sex work stigma, combined with the prevalence of violence against women in general, that makes romantic relationships with men dangerous for exotic dancers. Not really helpful, I know. One study does find that dancers have the same relationship satisfaction as those currently enrolled in college. So, there is that. Researchers have found that motherhood is common in exotic dancing. In one study, half of the interviewees were mothers, and 6 in 10 of those had a child while they were a teenager. It is a pathway into dancing since becoming a mother does cause the financial crisis that dancers often cite as a reason for entering the industry. It does allow the dancer to support her family without government assistance, which tends to be a mark of pride for the women. And finally, there have been no studies on if the dancers are students. What are they studying? In fact, there hasn't been any studies that I could find that attempted to ascertain the prevalence of students that dance, although the subject is brought up in interviews with some of the dancers either currently in college or planning on attending or returning. As we delve through more research, I'm pretty sure that we will come upon more articles that describe the typical exotic dancers in detail. So my disclaimer to this episode is that there are probably other articles out there that I have missed, and I make no guarantee of completeness. And with that, goodbye.